In the 1980s, a storm named Vince McMahon gathered in the Northeast, building a global empire by turning America's proud professional wrestling territories into a graveyard. He didn't just compete, he obliterated. He offered more money, more television, and a slick, cartoon-colored vision of the future that left the old ways in the dust. The AWA, dead. World-class championship wrestling? A ghost. One by one, from coast to coast, the old kingdoms fell. It was a shock and awe campaign that left a landscape of wreckage. But while the wrestling world burned, something different was happening in the Deep South. In the towns of Alabama and the Florida Panhandle, one promotion refused to fall. Now, it wasn't the only one to survive the 80s. Promotions in places like Memphis and Portland also fought on for years. But the story of Alabama wrestling is a masterclass in resistance. Protected by its unique culture and a powerful family dynasty, it didn't just survive Vince McMahon, it stared him down. This is the story of how one Southern territory, against all odds, held the line. To understand how Alabama survived, you first have to grasp the world Vince McMahon tore apart. For decades, wrestling in North America was a network of independent territories. A gentleman's agreement kept promoters from invading each other's turf. Holding it all together was the National Wrestling Alliance, or NWA, a coalition that recognized a single world heavyweight champion. Of course, it was a bit more complicated than that. Groups like the AWA and McMahon's own WWF had already broken away and crowned their own champions. But the NWA champ was still the man. This system created fierce regional loyalty. Fans in Memphis had Jerry the King Lawler. In Dallas, the Von Erichs were royalty. The stars weren't distant figures. They were local heroes you saw every week. The stories played out over months in hot, smoke-filled arenas, creating a passion that's hard to imagine today. Then came Vince. In 1982, he bought the WWF from his father, a loyal member of the old system. But Vince the Younger had no respect for gentlemen's agreements. He saw a future where wrestling was a national, even global phenomenon, and he was willing to burn the entire system down to get there. His war started on television. He used the power of cable and satellite to push the WWF into every home in America, right into his partners' backyards. Suddenly, a fan in St. Louis could see Hulk Hogan, Roddy Piper, and Andre the Giant. Then came the talent raids. He waved his checkbook and poached the top stars from every territory he could. The AWA lost Hulk Hogan, and with him, its future. Mid-South lost the Junkyard Dog. These weren't just employees changing jobs. They were the cornerstones of entire promotions being ripped out. Finally, the arena raids. McMahon would book WWF shows directly against local events, using his superior star power to bleed them dry. The old-school promoters didn't know how to fight a war like this. They were playing checkers. Vince was playing a game they didn't even recognize. Even a powerhouse like Georgia Championship Wrestling wasn't safe, though its end was more of a complex sale of its TV slot on TBS rather than a simple conquest on the ground. By the late 1980s, the war was all but over. Vince stood victorious. The territory days were done, or so it seemed. While Vince was building his empire, a different kind of empire was holding its ground in the Deep South. This was the empire of the Fuller family, one of the great and most underrated dynasties in wrestling history. At the center of our story is Ron Fuller, the Tennessee stud. A towering figure with wrestling in his blood, he also had a brilliant mind for the business. In 1974, Fuller bought the Knoxville territory, and a few years later expanded into the Gulf Coast territory of Alabama and the Florida Panhandle, fusing them into Southeastern Championship Wrestling. This family control was Alabama's first layer of armor. The Fullers were invested. This was their home. Their names, Fuller, Welch, Golden, were known and respected in every town they ran. They weren't outsiders, they were part of the community. The promotion was a true family affair. Ron's brother, Robert Fuller, later Colonel Robert Parker in WCW, was a top star. Their cousin, Jimmy Golden, was a main eventer. This core gave them a stability others lacked. If a top star in another territory got a better offer from New York, they left, leaving a huge hole. In Southeastern, the foundation was always there. This allowed them to build incredible long-term storylines. The most famous was the epic feud between the Fullers and the legendary Armstrong family. When the Fullers brutally injured the beloved patriarch Bullet Bob Armstrong, it sparked genuine outrage across the territory. The war that followed, with Armstrong's sons Brad, Steve, and Scott fighting for their father's honor, was the kind of deeply personal storytelling that builds unbreakable loyalty. People didn't just watch Southeastern, they lived and died with it. It was their promotion. If the Fuller family was the heart of the defense, Alabama's geography was its shield. Vince McMahon's strategy was simple: capture the big media markets. New York, LA, Chicago. His product was designed for massive urban crowds in major arenas. But Alabama wasn't a major media market. It was a collection of smaller, fiercely independent towns: Mobile, Montgomery, Dothan, Pensacola. For the WWF, a territory like this was a logistical nightmare. It wasn't that they couldn't invade, it's that it wasn't a priority compared to taking down a major city like Boston in a single blow. Survival here was as much about the WWF's strategic choices as it was about Continental's defenses. Ron Fuller understood this landscape perfectly. For a time, Southeastern operated with a northern division out of Knoxville and a southern one for Alabama and Florida, each with its own champions and feuds. Now, that structure wasn't always stable. A major conflict in Knoxville in the late 70s caused Fuller to refocus most of his energy on the southern end of the territory. Still, the strategy created geographic armor. It meant fans in Dothan had their champion, and he was the most important wrestler in the world to them. The arenas themselves were part of this armor. The WWF wanted to run 15,000-seat buildings. Southeastern thrived in 2,000-seat armories and high school gyms. They were hot, loud, and intimate. The fans were right on top of the action, creating a gritty, authentic atmosphere that made the WWF's polished production feel distant. Vince might have owned the airwaves, but Ron Fuller owned the ground. And in the towns of Alabama, the ground game was what mattered. Faced with this threat, the Fullers had to fight back. Ron Fuller knew he couldn't outspend Vince, so he fought a war on the ground, in the trenches of his own territory. In 1985, as the WWF's Rockin' Wrestling exploded, Fuller made a key move. He rebranded Southeastern Championship Wrestling as Continental Championship Wrestling. It was a brilliant name change. Continental sounded bigger, more important. It was a psychological move to tell his audience this wasn't some backwater promotion, but a major league player. There are even rumors that Fuller was in talks with the CBS network, a sign of how big he was thinking, though those stories have never been confirmed. The style was another weapon. While the WWF was moving toward family-friendly superheroes, Continental doubled down on what worked in the South: gritty, believable, violent realism. The feuds were personal, and the physicality was intense. This was a place for blood, not cartoons. The long-running war between the Armstrong and Fuller families was a prime example, built on betrayal and honor that felt deeply real to the audience. And when McMahon's forces did try to invade, Continental fought back. A legendary story, though one that lives more in fan lore than in documented records, tells of a night the WWF booked a big show in Nashville. On the same night, Continental ran nearby Chattanooga. Fuller supposedly scheduled a massive two-ring battle royal, cut ticket prices, and challenged fans to show their loyalty. As the story goes, Continental sold out its show, a stunning symbolic victory for the hometown heroes. The territory was a blend of old and new. It gave a platform to rising tag teams like The Nightmares and future stars like Shane Douglas, while local legends like Bullet Bob Armstrong and the revered veteran Ken Lucas anchored the promotion. This mix gave Continental a vibrancy many dying territories lacked. It wasn't a museum piece, it was a living, breathing promotion fighting for its life. The story of Continental Wrestling is a testament to the power of local identity and strategic resistance. If you're enjoying this deep dive into wrestling history, show your support by hitting that like button. And to make sure you don't miss more untold stories from the territory days, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. For a time, it seemed like the fortress might hold forever. Continental had stared down the most powerful force in wrestling and hadn't blinked. But no fortress can withstand a rising tide indefinitely. The end didn't come in one cataclysmic battle, but as a slow, sad erosion. The world was changing. Cable TV was now everywhere. A fan in Mobile, Alabama had 24/7 access to the WWF. The local TV stations that were the lifeblood of the territories began favoring cheaper, syndicated programming. The economic model that sustained the territories for 50 years was crumbling. Talent became harder to hold on to. A run in Continental could make you a hero in Alabama, but a run in the WWF could make you a household name. The pressure wasn't just from the WWF either. Jim Crockett Promotions, which would become WCW, was also expanding aggressively across the South, squeezing Continental from another direction. By 1988, Ron Fuller, the architect of the territory, decided it was time to move on. He sold the promotion to a TV station owner named David Woods. The name changed one last time to the Continental Wrestling Federation, and in a sign of the chaotic times, it severed its NWA ties to align with the dying AWA. It was a desperate move, but there was no shelter from the storm. By the end of 1989, the Continental Wrestling Federation closed its doors for good. It wasn't defeated by Vince McMahon in a head-to-head war. It was simply made obsolete by the New World. So what's the real reason Alabama wrestling survived as long as it did? It survived because it never tried to play Vince McMahon's game. While others were crushed trying to compete on a national scale, Continental built a shield forged from the bonds of a family dynasty too proud to surrender its homeland. It was reinforced by a fractured geography that made it a difficult target for a national conqueror, and it was wielded with a strategy that valued local passion over corporate polish. Continental didn't beat Vince McMahon. In the end, nobody did. And it wasn't the absolute last holdout. Memphis-based USWA, for instance, carried on well into the 1990s. But Continental outlasted almost everyone else. For a few glorious years, it stood as a defiant monument to the old ways, proving a wrestling territory could be more than a business. It could be a cultural institution and a source of fierce local pride. The legacy of Continental is not one of victory, but of defiance. It's a tragic story of a lost world washed away by history. But it's also a story of resilience, one of the last great examples of a Southern territory that adapted, fought, and survived on its own terms, long after most of the world had surrendered.